Hey, I've got a story for you. It's about a man who was born floating. Plucked from the nothingness of unconsciousness, the man opened his eyes, and all at once, he was alive. The blinding rays of a midday sun rushed into his pupils and burned a bright reflection of the world into his mind. He squinted his eyelids, but an afterimage remained, seared into his retina. With his eyes half closed, he raised his head to survey his surroundings. The clear sky above offered the man no shelter from the relentless light, so he placed his right hand upon his brow to shade his eyes. The man looked down at himself, then scanned from left to right. His body was laid upon a dense wooden floor, surrounded by dense wooden walls, all of which undulated with a nauseating cadence. He sat up, lifting his head to see past the swaying walls. As far and wide as the man could see, aside from the vessel in which he awoke and the sun that illuminated the world, he was surrounded by nothing but water and air. The sky above him held no clouds to shade the man from the sun's luster. The rolling cerulean ocean below carried the man's vessel, rocking it up and down, turning his quivering, empty stomach. He fixed his eyes on the unmoving horizon where the sky and ocean met, pondering what might exist beyond his sight, when suddenly a gust of wind blasted the man's naked body. His thoughts froze as his senses were overwhelmed by the chill of the biting wind. His skin tightened around every contour of his shivering muscles. The howl of the wind beat his eardrums, reverberating throughout his head. To preserve the furnace of warmth within his torso, he tucked his chin, curled his back, and withdrew his limbs. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the wind momentarily subsided. Tenderly, he uncurled his body and, with caution, arose to observe his surroundings once more. As he planted his feet and hoisted his torso above his hips, he stumbled. His legs shook, his knees buckled, and his heart fluttered with panic. He felt as if his awkward body was bound to drop down onto the wooden floor. In this frenzied state of mind, all his senses turned toward finding balance. Instinctually, his arms spread outward, reaching for stability. His knees bent downward to build a solid base. His core tightened, and his breathing slowed to a steady rhythm. In this position, he meditated on the forces that jostled his body around. He felt every tiny rise and fall of the floor beneath him, and shifted his stance in reaction. Just as the boat floated effortlessly upon the shifting waters, his legs learned how to float upon the boat's rocking wooden surface. Once he could stand, he began to walk. He paced around his vessel with curiosity, occasionally kneeling and extending his hands to feel the surface of its floor and walls. Its wood was smooth to the touch, with a continuous grain running from end to end, uninterrupted by any creases or joints. Looking down from the front of the ship, he saw the sharp, tapered point of the bow cutting effortlessly through the seawater. Next, he walked 8 steps towards the ship's back end. The rounded stern left gentle ripples on the water surface almost indistinguishable from the serene expanse of undisturbed ocean surrounding the boat as it drifted onward. Onward to where? The man had nary the faintest clue. The boat had no sail nor rudder, which the man could use to alter its course, and the whimsical currents carried the boat around, with no discernible pattern. The man may have awoken upon this ship, but it was not made for him. He pushed and pulled on every surface of the boat's floor and walls, trying to force it to move where he wished, but nothing happened. He leaned over each edge of the boat, thrust his arms into the ocean, and paddled through the water, but the ocean's currents immensely overpowered him. He pushed and pulled and paddled until he could no longer will his body to move. All the while, the boat continued to aimlessly drift. Exhausted and disheartened, the man stopped fighting. With his last ounce of energy, he cried out for help. He pleaded to the sky for clouds to shield him from the brilliant sun, but it gave him nothing. He begged the ocean's currents to carry him towards something comforting, somewhere safe, but once again, no response. The ocean silently continued to move the boat, with no concern for his prayers. The man begged and protested, but nobody was alive to listen. As the man's will to resist the world weakened, he grew sober to the futility of his circumstances. A feeling of quiet desperation welled up from the pit of his very being, until it cascaded over him, engulfing his mind in a bottomless despair. He was truly and utterly stranded, doomed to a life spent upon a floating wooden island, destined to die alone. He sat down upon the hard floor, buried his head upon his knees, and wrapped his arms around his legs, embracing himself. Then he began to weep. How can my 2 weak hands direct this unmovable vessel, he thought. He mourned his pathetic existence and wept. How can my 2 strained eyes see under this blinding sun? As the vorpal winds whipped his raw back, he wept. How can one small man navigate this endless ocean? Tears dripped from his eyes, and whimpers slipped from his mouth, until the sun descended beyond the horizon. The black night fell upon the man before he was even ready to face the day. The man cried until he had no tears left to give. As the daylight faded around him, so too did the lingering embers of hope barely alive within. He closed his dry eyes and resigned himself to his fate. He sat, hopeless, waiting to be swallowed by the abyss. The sun set, and the night arrived. And yet, a whisper of warmth tickled the man's vision through his thin eyelids. Warily, he opened his eyes once more. In the darkness of night, the man noticed a faint luminescence that glimmered through the cracks between his tear-stained knees. Tenderly, he uncurled his tired body. The man wiped his eyes, but the only thing that clouded his vision was his own disbelief. A gentle glow blanketed him. Moving twinkles of light reflected off the ocean's dancing surface. He wondered, why does light remain when my sun has set? He raised his head to search for the source of this soothing light in the night sky. Everywhere his eyes could reach, the man saw glowing milky clouds that perforated the darkness above and illuminated the world below. He stared in awe. He gazed into the swirl of soft fluorescence and realized that this heavenly comfort wasn't emanating from one, but innumerable sources. Like pinholes in the blackness revealing the infinity beyond the horizon, the light that filled his eyes and bathed his body came from countless stars scattered throughout the cosmos. The individual flicker of each distant star in the vast sky joined together into clusters of gentle brilliance. The man realized that the radiant light from the daytime sun of his world blinded him from the boundless universe all around him. Now that his eyes were open to the light, he could not avert his gaze. Each time he blinked and reopened his eyelids, he felt as if he was witnessing this celestial beauty for the first time again, as if he and the universe around him were reborn each and every time. Once more, the man's eyes spoke his feelings, and he began to weep. This time, the tears that rolled down the man's face did not spill from despair. Rather, they were solemn tears of gratitude. This time he cried, for he realized that he, one man, sitting upon a directionless boat, floating amidst an endless ocean, was allowed to look up and admire the beauty of a life among the infinite. He rested his tired eyes, laid down his tired body, and slept, content, knowing that he had arrived in a place where he belongs. The end.